Hey, what's up, everybody, and welcome to another episode of Rappin with ReefBum. I'm your host, Keith Berkelhamer, and every episode I talk with a person in the reef keeping community. And today, on this episode, I am welcoming Bill Bramucci. Sorry, Bill, I butchered the last name. Bramucci, right?
Bramucci, yes, sir.
Also known as, Saw C Jack 00 on Reef to Reef, and we're going to ask you about that one in terms of how you came up with that name. But hey, Bill, man, welcome to the show. I really appreciate you joining me on the show.
Absolutely. Good to be with you, Keith.
So, COVID-19, obviously these are very interesting times today. What's going on in your life? How are you guys handling, you and your family?
Well, it's kind of interesting because both my wife and I work from home, and therefore, it hasn't been as huge of an impact on our day-to-day lives. We wake up in the morning and, go into our respective offices and do what we were doing before. Of course, the weekends are a little different, though, and we're not really doing much of anything on the weekends. So I will say I have lots of time to mess with the tanks, but that can be a dangerous thing too. So, but yeah, it's unusual for sure. And we're fortunate in Arizona. We haven't had as many cases here, and the state has begun to reopen. So, there's a lot more cars on the road, and businesses are starting to open, which, hopefully it's a good thing. It kind of remains to be seen, but slowly, but hopefully surely, maybe we'll get to some semblance of normalcy over the next few months. But overall, we're doing fine, though.
Yeah, I live in Vermont, and I think we have under 1,000 cases. So
Wow.
Yeah, it really hasn't been, a lot of cases in Vermont. I think the concern is where we border New York State. It's upstate New York. We're not, we're 5.5 hours away from New York City, which at one point was the real epicenter, but now the cases are going down there. So, yeah, things are starting to reopen here in Vermont too, and hopefully everything will get back to semi-normal. But I agree, a lot of time to spend with the tank and tinker and stuff. It is good and it is bad.
Right.
So, all right, Bill, before we get into it, what's the deal with that username? What's the significance there?
That goes back That goes back a long ways. I am a big fan of the movie This Is Spinal Tap. I don't know if you know uh, but it was a parody of a heavy metal band. It was about 1980, I think the movie came out. And in the movie, they discussed doing a musical version of the story of Jack the Ripper. And so they were going to title it Saucy Jack. And so that's where it came from, and it was the year 2000, so that's where the 00 came from. And so all my personal emails and my username is always SaucyJack00 for the last 20 years.
Well, you know, I guess there's always a story behind the username there, and yeah, that's pretty unique. That's pretty unique. My username, I love to ski, so you know, ski bum, reef bum. You know, why not?
There you go.
Yeah, why
combine
not?
the two. Yeah.
So we got a couple of folks that are chiming in the chat here. We've got Nick Korn. He said he bought an Oregon tort from you a couple of months back, and you sent him a free red planet for his birthday. So he says you're such a cool guy.
Well, I appreciate that, Nick, and hope the corals are doing well for you.
And Kenneth Bryant says, howdy, Bill.
Yeah, Ken's a good friend of mine. He's between him and another buddy here, Jimmy Cox. We're kind of the three amigos on working on each other's tanks, and Jimmy's helped immensely with some of the projects I have going with the new fish room and things like that. And they both were here to save me when my new tank was brought in, because the moving company assured me they'd have enough people, but 3 people was not enough to lift an 830-pound tank. So whoa. I had a little backup there.
Yeah, wow, that is a big friggin' tank. So, Bill, before we get into the whole story in terms of your tanks and whatnot, how many years have you been in the hobby, and how did you get your start with reef keeping?
Sure. So I started with saltwater tanks back in about 1991. And like a lot of people, I got a job at a pet store, and they had a fish section, and I had done a lot of freshwater fish when I was young. My dad got me started on that, and they bought me a 29-gallon tank when I was probably in about junior high, which I promptly put piranhas in, of course, as a young teenager would be fascinated with. But I did freshwater for a long time, and then I got that job at the pet store right around 1991, and they wanted to implement saltwater there. So I did my own research and did lots and lots of reading, some classic books that I still have that are just great foundations for learning the marine hobby. And they put me in charge of opening the saltwater part of that fish room, which went pretty well. Now, it was all fish. It was not any corals. And, of course, back then, there weren't nearly as many reef tanks and such. And when I looked at some of those things, you look at, like, Albert Thiel's book back in the day, and it looked like a nuclear lab. Yeah. When, it's diagrams for the way you should set up a tank. And I said, I'm not ready for that. So I did fish only for a while, and then in the late 90s, I just decided, you know what, it's time. I got to do this. I really was much more interested in the reef and the actual corals than I was fish. And so I went on to Reef Central and found a local club. At this point, I was living up in Minneapolis. The local club was the Twin Cities Marine Aquarium Society, TCMAS. And I got found a mentor who lived very close to me. His name was David Greiger, and he's very well known in that area, and actually was the 2017 MACNA Aquarist of the Year. So that was kind of neat. He got presented with that at MACNA. But anyway, he also was a very handy person, had woodworking tools. So when I decided I wanted to convert a tank over to Reef, he helped me build a stand for it, build a canopy, really guided me on, how to light the tank, what type of filtration. We built a sump together out of acrylic. So that was a great start. And me and him did a lot of reefing together. We used to buy corals online, and then we'd split them, so we'd get a colony in and cut it in half, and each one of us would take half, and it was a lot of fun. From there, I kind of, the tanks started to kind of explode. I ended up having a 125-gallon reef, a 55-gallon octopus tank, which was short-lived, and I changed that over to community tank because the octopus, well, they don't live a very long life anyway. But and then I decided I wanted to start fragging the corals, and I wanted a bigger display tank. So at that point, I got a custom-made 450-gallon acrylic tank, and that went in my our basement. And from there, I set up basically an aquaculture facility there, called it North Star Corals, and set up a website, northstarcorals.com, and I was selling corals online all over the country. In fact, I sold at least one pack to every state on the continental United States, which was kind of cool. And fortunately, it didn't last all that long because it got so busy that I really had to make a decision on not I wanted to stick to do that, which I was doing part-time, or to stick with my real full-time job. And especially back then when I had kids at home and family, you know, that needed to be supported, I couldn't really take the chance on that kind of a risky business. So it got to be too much, and I shut it down and just continued with the hobby aspect of things. But it was kind of neat because when I got back into things at our new house here in Arizona, I went on to battlecorals.com, and Adam you got some great frags, beautiful corals. But one of the ones that he carries is North Star's Corals Pink Clathrata. And so it was kind of neat because I got a frag of that from him. So now I got one of my babies back from back in 2000 or so when I imported it myself. So kind of neat. But now we did live in Florida for quite a while, including the Florida Keys for about 7 years. I had a nice reef tank down there. Unfortunately, Hurricane Irma made landfall on the island and basically destroyed our neighborhood. I kept the tank going for about a week with a generator, but there was no gas down there, and we were without power for 28 days. So it ended up, the tank died, unfortunately. And after that, we decided to move. So we decided to go away from the ocean where the hurricanes are and come to the desert where we have a few less natural disasters, and hopefully we'll be a little safer. And but I was actually born here, and my parents live here, and I have family in California, and so it was nice to be close to family again and such. And we love it here. We love the mountains. We love the Grand Canyon. We love the fact that we're close to a lot of places, in terms of other states and the things that you can see at those other states. So it's been a great move. And then of course moving into a bigger house meant a bigger tank. So I bought a Red Sea 750, which is my current display tank, and set that up, and then things have kind of grown from there. So,
well, that's quite a journey there, Bill, in terms of
it has been
your journey through life and reef keeping. But
yes.
So you talked about your current tank, and what you did was you shot some video for us to kind of show the new tank and the old setup. And we were just talking before the show how it looks a little crowded in that room where you have all those tanks. But I'm gonna show this tank, and listen, feel free to narrate here if you're watching it on YouTube.
So that's the new tank. It is 460 gallons, built by Miracles Aquariums, 3/4 inch Starfire glass on 3 sides. It is set up in a peninsula setup. It's right now the lighting, that's a few T5 bulbs. So in the long run, it's going to be T5 and hybrid with the radians. I just got all of those fish in there out of quarantine yesterday. There's about 20 damsels in there, 5 yellow tangs, a purple tang, and a hippo tang. So the tank is cycled. Down there you can see the sump, and you can also see back behind some of my frag tanks. Now this is my Colorado Sunburst Anemone tank. There's 2 of them in there, and they're both about 1 foot wide, so they don't split very often, but they are beautiful anemones. This is my current display tank. It's the Red Sea Reefer 750 XXL. Obviously you can see I'm primarily into the SPS corals. These were every one of them was grown out of a frag. Not one, I did not purchase a single colony for this tank. So these have all grown out over the last 2 years, and they've been fragged many, many times. And you can see they're kind of packed in there, which is one of the main reasons for the new tank. I need to get them spread out so that they can spread their wings, stretch their legs, and grow out into full-size colonies. So, but it's been a very successful tank. Like I said, it's been going for 2 years as of the end of March. Now back here, that's the sump for the tanks on the left there. Those are both 40-gallon or 50-gallon lowboys. The top one is a frag tank. The bottom one is a grow-out tank. So I have corals that were propagated from my display tank. That's the back side of the 460 right there. And then I had grown out those into mother colonies. I have another grow-out tank that's in a different room that you don't see here. Of course, there's the sump. It's a very nice custom-made Bash C sump. They made it 24 inches wide for me, so my skimmer will fit in there, but it's not in there yet. And then on that system, I run the GHL Profilux, and on this system, I run the Apex. So I'm kind of experimenting with both to see which one is more effective. And that last shot, you could see the narrow kind of hallway, if you will, between the tanks, and that's about 12 inches wide right now. I basically have to turn sideways to sneak through there, and most of my friends can't get through it. I'm a pretty small guy. Most of my friends are a little bigger than me, but in the long run, the plan is that I will be transferring all of the livestock from the current Red Sea tank into the new large tank, and then that Red Sea tank will be coming out of there. At that point, we're also going to be building a wall on the front of the tank. So when you view the tank from the front in the hallway, it will appear as an in-wall tank. It'll have the short side end will be also exposed. So you'll have both those views, the length and the front. I've got a removable background for the tanks so that if I want to take the background off and view it from the back, I can do that while I'm in the fish room. Which again will be walled off and a door will be there. So you won't see all of that equipment and the frag tanks and all of that stuff behind, and it'll look, it'll look more similar to your standard in-wall type of tank. So I'm pretty excited about that.
So Bill, this is this build up here in terms of the new setup, and I want to kind of like dive deeper into the setup. We saw some stuff in terms of the equipment that you use, but in terms of where you're going with this and what your aspirations are, tell us about your new business. You mentioned
Sure.
North Star Corals, and now you're going to launch another company, right?
Yes, sir. Actually, I technically started it on January 1st. I did formerly have a full-time that I was working remotely. That job ended. I knew it was going to. It did end a little sooner than I'd hoped, but my exit plan from that job was that I intended to go into aquaculturing corals and have an online presence as well as a local presence to sell those corals. Ideally, it would have been probably about 2 years down the road, but that did get escalated with my previous position going away. So I've kind of dived all in as of January and started Epic Aquaculture. I have a website that is actually going to go live tomorrow, so this is good timing to be talking with you today. It's www.epicaquaculture.com, or you can get there by going to eacorals.com also. And right now I'm specializing in SPS corals, in particular a lot of what people are calling high-end type of corals. A lot of the newer, imported corals, the rainbow tenuis and some of the different milliporas that have been coming in and such. And again, these are all aquacultured corals. So I define that by if a colony is imported, if it's been in captivity for at least a year, at that point, if I'm taking frags off of it, I would consider that to be a captive raised coral, and those would be aquaculture. And of course, as they grow out in other tanks, go on to hopefully be aquacultured by other people. So that's what I'm doing right now. All of the corals that I'm selling are corals that have come from my display tank. So they've been with me at least 2 years. Well, I shouldn't say that because, of course, I bought corals during over the 2 years. But they've been with me and come from other members who aquacultured them. And they've been in my tanks for quite a while now. And I've grown them out into mother colonies outside of the tank in my grow-out tanks. So these are all very much captive grown corals that are I think a lot of people would agree the captive grown corals are definitely more resilient to changes and the different types of conditions that we all corals in. So to me, they're basically tougher than a wild caught coral, and for that reason, I think more sustainable too. Like I said, I've begun that, and with that in mind, of course, the new tank has become what's going to be more or less my coral bank. It's a separate system from all of my grow out tanks and my frag tanks. I have them tied together because obviously if something goes wrong in one of the systems, I don't want it to knock out my display tank, or my display tank has a problem. I don't want it to knock out the aquaculture tanks and such. So, but it is, like I said, it's a backup tank for me in terms of being able to, if something does happen in the aquaculture tanks, I can go to my display tank and cut another piece and start growing it out again. So that was one of the reasons that I did want to get a much larger tank and be able to get these into there with much more room to grow. So I'm super excited about getting that up.
It's always good to have redundancy, that's for sure, right?
Absolutely, absolutely. And I believe that, when it comes to equipment, it's also good to have even on a single system for sure.
Yeah, me too. All right, let's show some of this eye candy in the grow out tank. This is your Vivids confetti. Just a beautiful coral.
That is one of my favorites. It is truly an amazing piece, and quite honestly, it's a very fast grower once it's established too. So, beautiful piece, yeah.
This is the TGC Cherry Bomb.
Yep, that is a classic tenuous. Obviously, the bright red polyps, the pink branches with the baby blue tips, and again, that's another fast grower once it's established. And whenever anybody asks me, oh well, what would you say is a must-have coral? That's always one of them that I bring up right there. So.
All right, now this one I'm going to bring up next. Kind of made my heart skip a beat here. This is the rainbow splice. Tell us a story about that.
So I actually saw this on Reef Builders, Jake Adams' site. When it was originally raised by Reef Raft Canada, and they grew it out from a frag that it was a very small frag. You can see it on that article. And basically, it's not an actual spliced coral. It's he did not take a pink millipora and a green millipora and combine them. What it is it's actually a hot pink millipora that has a green protein, is what they call it, or a GFP. And so basically, that green in the coral, it grows into the different tissues and it colors it up. So I can cut a piece off of this that's completely pink with no green in it whatsoever, and it'll develop the green. And the same with the green side. If I cut a piece off of it on the green side, it'll develop the pink in it. It's really a neat piece. I believe that my colony of it is probably one of the biggest, maybe in the world, if not the biggest. Most of the people that have acquired it, because it is a very expensive piece, they've tended to try to get their money back fragging it up. I have not sold a single frag of this yet. I have cut 2 frags off of it that are my backup frags, and that's it. So right now I get a lot of requests for it, but I'm still growing it out. I love it so much that I don't want to take the knife to it. So, but I will have eventually pieces available on my website, though.
So here's the big question. How much is a frag of that going to cost?
Well, right now the going rate on it is $2,000 for about a half an inch frag.
Wow.
And I did pay that. And the frag that I got was tiny. I got it back in May, so it's just about a year old now. And obviously, what I will say about it is it's a very resilient coral. It's very tough. It's never ever suffered. I better knock on wood, but it has not suffered any setbacks. I pull it out of the tank a lot to examine it, and of course, if I'm doing some surgery on it, I've cut some growth tips off and then placed them around the bottom of the base to help it get a larger base and grow. And I'll pull it out and mess with it in the air and then put it back in, and the polyps are right back out. So, when you're talking about investing that kind of money in a coral, which that's a crazy price. I fully admit it. It's one of them that you can pretty much be assured that, barring no shipping issues, it's gonna live for you and not be a real touchy coral and grow for you. So, yeah, Now, when I actually get to selling them, I don't know that I'll charge a full $2,000. That price is pretty darn high.
Yeah.
But we'll see. Right now, it's listed on my site at that price, but there's none available anyway. So.
So we got Carrier Reef for 500. He's asking what's the name of this coral? It's the RRC Rainbow Splice. What's the RRC stand for?
That's Reef Raft Canada.
Ah, okay.
So and they're an aquaculture facility up in Canada, and of course it's illegal to transport corals over the border. But somebody managed to do that and got this coral into the United States, and I found out who that was and contacted them for the purchase. So,
man, that's a score. You know what? For $2,000, if you grow that out into a big piece, then it's well worth it. You just gotta. And this is going to kind of like lead into the next part of the whole conversation in terms of how you've had your success that you've had with the SPS and so let's start with the calcium and alkalinity supplementation. What do you typically do with that? Are you a two-part dosing guy, or do you use calcium reactors? What are you using for that?
Yes. Yes, actually, so I like to experiment with a lot of different things, and I've tried almost every part of reefing. So on my display tank, I use a Destaco automatic calcium reactor, which has been one of the best investments I've made. It's really a set it and forget it piece of machinery. There's no messing with the bubble counter or your flow rates or anything like that. You just turn a dial and increase your alkalinity, or decrease it if you need to. So fantastic on that setup. With the new setup and the aquaculture tanks, those are, again, they're on my GHL system. So I decided to go with the KH director on that. On the display tank, I run an Alcatronic, and that keeps my calcium reactor at the same levels all the time. So it's pretty steady when it comes. I would try to run my DKH around 8. And obviously stability is the key, not so much the number. I think personally anywhere between 7 and even up to 10 is just fine as long as you're there at all times. So on the new system, I'm running the KH director, so I decided to go with 2-part dosing on that, and I'm using the ESV B-Ionic for that. And again, that's been set it and forget it too. The KH director is a great product by GHL, and it's just been so easy to use. So yeah, I'm doing both. I've always loved calcium reactors. I think that especially on larger, economical way to go, and they just require a lot less maintenance and such. So on the new tank, I'll be moving the calcium reactor over to that from the Red Sea tank when that gets taken down. So going forward, I'll still be doing both though on the tanks.
So the with the GHL KH director, are you and also with the Alcatronic, are you using that not only as a monitor but also as a controller? So are you essentially having certain parameters set where you're saying to the controller or the unit, hey, if the alk gets below or above a certain level, the calcium gets above or below a certain level, change the dosing accordingly? Are you doing that?
Exactly. Yeah, I'm using the adaptive dosing on the KH director, which is a real neat feature. It bases it on percentage. So you set up your doser, you determine what your alk usage is in a day approximately, you set your doser to try to match that, and then the KH director will adjust it by percentages as it does the testing. If it determines that it's low, it's going to increase the next dose. If it determines that it's high, it's going to decrease the next dose by the percentage that you put in there. And it really does. It keeps it absolutely rock solid. It's a super device. I couldn't be more impressed. And I just started using that within the last couple of months here. The Alcatronic is another great piece of equipment, and that controls my calcium reactor. Basically, it turns it off if the alkalinity gets too high. If the alkalinity is too low, it has a dosing pump set to dose sodium bicarbonate. And that rarely happens on me because my calcium reactor usually keeps up with it. But if I happen to run out of CO2 and don't notice it or something like that, the Alcatronic will go ahead and dose that sodium bicarbonate as a kind of a stopgap until I can get my CO2 refilled. But that's been a great machine. I've been using that for about 1.5 years now, and it's been pretty much flawless. So.
And the great thing about the adaptive dosing, elements of these devices is that, let's say there's a reading that's due to something, let's say air bubbles in the line that's feeding tank water or whatnot, and you're going to get a bizarre reading. You can actually bake that in right to the adaptive dosing and essentially say that if there's a reading that's way out of range, pretty much ignore it, right, in terms of dosing.
Exactly, that's right, and that's a great fail-safe, because the last thing you want to do is leave your aquarium to computers and then have the computer be wrong. There's already enough problems with human error, and definitely don't need that.
All right, so Bill, let's go on to lighting. And when you first started to keep SPS, were you a halide guy like me? I still use halides. I can't get away from them, but I'm definitely looking to.
Yeah, and quite honestly, to some extent, I wish I could. Where you're at, you of course have the nice cold winters. Here, a cold day in the winter is maybe 60 degrees, and the rest of the year, we get temperatures in. Even next week, it's going to be 108 degrees or so here, and in the summer it'll get up to 115 pretty regularly. So metal halides, I could run them, but they produce so much heat. It is a small room that the tank is going to be located in once I wall that off, and so I made the switch over to LEDs. But I'm also a firm believer in T5s. I've had T5 tanks in the past and had just great success with them. So I figure, best of both worlds. So all of my systems, including my grow out tanks, my frag tanks, and my display tanks, all use the aquatic light fixtures with T5s and Radian G4 or the XR30 G4s. So I've had very good luck with the Radian products. I firmly believe that halide grows corals faster, but I think that the Radians in particular and some of the other high-end LEDs really give you some great coloration that sometimes doesn't seem to come out with the halides. And so with the lower heat that they produce, it just made it the better choice for my situation here. But I do miss my halides. I ran the I generally liked the 14K is what I had, and I was into the AB space lights back in the day. Those were really neat fixtures, and so I had the double-ended 250-watt bulbs. But there's so many good metal halide bulbs out there, and they're tried and proven that if you have an area where you can do that, especially if you're trying to get good growth in particular, man, so. And the great thing with them is they're set it and forget it. You don't have to. You aren't adjusting the different bulbs to get different coloration. And sometimes I think with LEDs, one of my issues initially anyway was there was just too much control. I could do all these different things and I messed with it so much. Now I don't mess with it anymore. I've settled on what I'm doing, and I basically I do about half the day with just all blues. I find that I get really good colors developing with the all blues. But I don't like to view the tank that way because it doesn't look natural to me. So that's more or less for the coloration. And then I run it on the AB Plus schedule for the other half of the day when I'm in the afternoons, and that's when I'm viewing the tank the most and when we have friends over, so they're viewing it and such. And of course, that's a wider spectrum, still on the blue side, but it's a proven spectrum to get good growth and good coloration. And now I just don't mess with it anymore and move on to other things to mess with.
How'd you come up with your light profile? Is that just something you developed over time, or did you find one that somebody had that you liked?
So I've talked to a lot of different reefers at shows, talked to different reefers in my local area, and then of course on the boards, Reef to Reef, Reef Central, messaging other successful reefers when I see somebody who has a system where their tank looks spectacular, they're getting great growth and things like that. There's nothing like personal experience for teaching, and so I reach out to people. I'll just send them a private message, or if it's in a thread, I'll say, what are you doing here? What kind of schedule you have going? And basically, that's what it's done. It's kind of a combination of what I've seen other people doing and having success with. And, you know, again, the AB Plus spectrum used on the radians is a tried and true spectrum that is used in a lot of places. A lot of the bigger vendors like Worldwide Corals and such, they use a modified version of that. And you know, it's just something that has worked for a lot of people, me included.
Yeah, I know it's interesting. There's just so many options out there, and I'm definitely going to dabble in LEDs at some point soon. And
Yeah.
you know, it's but yeah, no, that's good to know. So in terms of nutrient export, what do you typically lean on with that? Are you do you utilize GFO at all, or are you just basically looking at natural means using a fuge or an algae reactor or an algae scrubber? What do you do to keep your nutrients in check, and also what do you maintain, like your nitrates and phosphates at?
Sure. So I shoot for nitrates somewhere between 5 and 10. Doesn't worry me much if it goes a little bit higher than that, even up to 20 or even up to 30. But ideally, I try to keep it around 5 or 10. If it drops below 5, then I'm going to increase my feeding as much as possible. I run an algae turf scrubber. I don't run a refugium because I did initially run a refugium, and I have actually had some real nice refugiums that were show refugiums where I had them on. But in this setup, first off, when I started running the refugium, my nutrients got too low, and the chaetomorpha that I had in there died off on me. Well, that happened a couple of times when the setup was new, so I decided to try the algae turf scrubber, and managed to find a nice one used, and it's been amazing. So now I'm a huge believer in algae turf scrubbers. They are more efficient than a refugium. The turf algae uptakes those nutrients much faster than any of the larger macroalgae will. And they're super easy to maintain. You know, basically once every other week on a Friday, I'll pull my screen out and scrape it off. I get massive amounts. I mean, balls of, you know, hair algae like this big, and I just throw it away. But I do not have any algae in the display tank. It's, you know, it's amazing to me how that algae can grow so fast down in the sump, but up in the display tank, you know, the competition for the nutrients between the ATS and the tank, the ATS wins out every time. So that's actually one of my main methods of exporting. The I do run high-powered skimmers, but in a lot of cases, I actually skim very dry, or sometimes not even pulling anything at all, and using it more for raising pH and oxygenating the water. I have found that if I really skim, I can bottom out my nutrients very quickly, and that causes major problems, especially with SPS corals. Can definitely lead to dino outbreaks. And other problems, you know. So I try to really keep my nutrients at a steady level. For PO4 or phosphate, I keep that right around 0.04 to 0.1. Again, anywhere in there, I'm fine with it. If it gets above that, that's when I would use some GFO. I don't run GFO normally. I do have a reactor for it that I can plug in, and I have done that. In fact, recently I overdosed on some phosphate, and I had to run some GFO overnight and do a water change, but it brought it down quite quickly back to normal levels, so there was no harm done. The other method I use is back in the day, of course, we could get live rock from the ocean, from the South Pacific specifically. That was just amazing stuff, and I loved it and wish we could still do that. Unfortunately, really the only live rock source now is you know, the Gulf, and it's not really the same as live rock from, say, Fiji and such.
Yeah.
And so I started all my tanks with dry rock, and of course I supplemented with bacteria. I've also ordered products from Indo-Pacific Sea Farms in Hawaii to get the South Pacific fauna in there and microorganisms. And basically, though, I don't really count on my live rock to do a lot of filtration because it's not nearly as porous as the old days, so it doesn't have as much room for your bacteria to grow and such. So what I do count on are other biological media, and I primarily use Cyperax, and also Matrix from Seachem. I use the pond matrix. It's larger, easier to keep in a bag, and I'll just put them in the web bags into the sump. The one problem I've run into with the Super X is it is made of sintered glass, so you can have some silicates that will leach from it. Generally, it's only at the beginning, but it can cause some diatom blooms. But overall, both those products have been great for me as far as how, a space for that biological filtration to develop, and really done a good
And with
job.
those products, you're basically just putting it in the system and you're letting it do its thing.
Exactly. Yep. And the nice thing is that now that I have a very well-seated and very mature display tank, when I'm setting up these new tanks, like my grow-out systems and such, all I have to do is reach in the sump and pull out a bag of matrix and throw it in the other sump, and I've got an instant mature tank. So I did that for the new tank, and the cycle is already done, and of course I'm being patient with moving things over there. I won't start doing that for a few months still. But with the grow-out tanks and the frag tanks, I was able to get those going right away, and basically it's very similar water to what's in my display tank. So it works perfectly.
That's interesting. I mean, so starting a new tank, basically you're saying that you primarily start a new tank with dry rock, and you use these products to seed it, not leaning exactly on live rock to help seed. Yeah, I mean, I had a situation a few years ago where I started my new 187-gallon tank, and I started it with the Marco dry rock, which is the first time I ever started a tank with dry rock, and it was just one issue after another. But I added the Fritz bacteria in a bottle product, but it just wasn't it just wasn't enough, and I had tons and tons of issues with that tank, and got frustrated and rebooted it with live rock. I found some actual live rock down in Orlando in a place called Sea and Reef. They had a whole ton of Haitian live rock, which was like a big score for me. So I took some home on the airplane, but had to pay a pretty penny to get that to fly back home with me. Hey, another thing, Bill, in terms of I noticed in your new tank, and I didn't notice in the old tank, but I saw some sand in the new tank. Is that just basically for cosmetics, or are you not really worried about again having that as a bacteria bed? Or you just like sand in the tank?
Yeah, basically, I'm a huge fan of wrasses, and several of the wrasses that I have, including the blue striped tamarin wrasse that I have, they require sand. They sleep in the sand, and so in order to accommodate them.
That's awesome.
Yeah, it's a beauty. It's pretty much my favorite fish. Yep, there it is. Gorgeous fish, and it's been a dream fish. It's ate the first minute I put it in the tank, and it loves to eat bugs and eat other things that may end up in the tank. So it's a great fish as far as eliminating pests and such. But I have several fish like that do require the sand. I also like the look of sand. I think I've done bare bottom tanks in the past, and it's certainly great as it gives you a lot of ability with your flow and where you can put power heads and such, which with the sand I do have to watch that. But with the bare bottom tanks, I have found them not to be quite as stable for me. I know lots of people have great success with that, but and I don't know if it's because the sand allows for more stability with a bigger biological filter, or if it's maybe just something in my head, so it's psychosomatic. I don't know, but I've just found for me personally, I've had better success when I do the sand bed. I do not do a deep sand bed. It's about 2 inches. And I do have sand sifters in there. I've got a pair of Bella gobies that actually just laid eggs yesterday for the second time. That was neat to watch. But they keep my sand bed pretty much spotless. And then, of course, I have lots of sand sifting stars and microfauna in there, and Necarious snails that keep it all stirred up so that it doesn't end up becoming a detritus trap.
Also, do you maintain it all, or do you just lean on your cleanup crew to do that for you?
No, actually, that's what I was going to say, is on a weekly basis, I take, actually, it's not even a power head. It's actually a skimmer pump that I had in my collection. So it's about 600 gallons per hour. So it's fairly powerful. I use that to blow off all of my rock every Friday, and I blow the sand. So I actually get, you know, above the sand, just blow it all over the place. And any detritus that's in there gets into the water column, goes down through my filter floss, and hopefully gets most of it out of there. And
so
then I do water
you're
change.
running the tank, the pumps, and all that stuff while you're doing that, so it can get into the water column.
Absolutely. In fact, I turn all of the power heads on full at that point. I also have a couple of the gyre pumps, turn those on full. So everything's at 100% and, you know, gets everything suspended, and hopefully most of it goes over the overflow. And then, like I said, I run filter cups in the sump with filter floss that I change out every couple of days. So that gets a lot of that detritus out of there. And then when I do a water change, I'll vacuum the sump, of course, to get whatever got through the filter floss out of there too.
Bill, I want to go back to the algae scrubber that you were talking about, and you know, you mentioned in terms of what you like to maintain nitrates and phosphates at. Do you dose nitrates and phosphates at all, or do you essentially just adjust the light cycle on the algae scrubber and feed your fish more or less depending on what you're seeing, you know, with the nutrients?
Sure. Yeah. So what I do is I try to avoid dosing. I do have it on hand just in case. And what I've tried to do is basically I'm a huge believer in high import, high export. And I think the best food for, in particular, SPS corals is fish waste. So I believe in having a very high bioload, lots and lots of fish. And of course, having that biological media like Super X and Matrix really helps with that. So I have a very high bioload, and trying to get that fish waste into the water so the SPS can feed off of it. And so if I am running low, I will increase my feeding, and that's my preferred way of raising nutrients. But if it's really low, if it bottoms out, I don't like to let it go for even a day, just because, like I said, the biggest impact that can have, immediate impact, can be dinoflagellates. And so I do everything to avoid that. So in that case, I will dose, and I'm very careful about the dosing to try to get it into the ranges that I spoke about before. The other thing that I'll do is I'll raise or lower the photo period on the algae turf scrubber. Right now, I'm pretty well dialed in, which is great. I do check it twice a week on my nitrates and phosphates on that. On my grow out systems, I'm checking those pretty much every day right now, because it's been kind of crazy the amount of phosphate and nitrate that it processes on a daily basis. So I've actually had to dose on those. I'm currently working on getting a few more fish into those tanks so that hopefully it'll be a little more on the autopilot, like the display tank is. But yeah, my main means, first thing I'll do is feed heavier if it gets low. Second thing I'll do is increase the photo period on the algae turf scrubber, and then also reduce the skimming if you know, if I'm skimming at all. Like I said, I always run the skimmer, but a lot of times I'll keep it on a real low setting so that it's just oxygenating the water and helping with the pH. But if it is skimming at that point, you know, that's one thing that I can do to lower or to raise the phosphates and the nitrates.
How often
too.
are you feeding your fish, and what do you primarily feed them?
So I would love to make my own fish food, but I have so many other things that I have to do during the day, and it causes such a mess, and my wife just doesn't want me using her blender and things like that. So yeah, I feed frozen food, primarily San Francisco Bay brand. I use their mysis shrimp and their variety packs, and then I feed the tank sheets of nori, raw nori, in a clip. But I feed, what I do is I have a pretty good size glass ball jar that I fill up with a bunch of the cubes about every 3 or 4 days. Put some RO water in there, along with Celcon and Boyd's Vitachem, which I think is a great product. And then let it all melt, basically, or thaw out, and into kind of a soup. And then I use a scoop, and I feed the tanks 3 times a day, once in the morning, once in the afternoon, once at night. And the scoop holds about, I would say, 50 milliliters. And I'm not sure how many cubes that comes out to, but I calculated it one time, and I'm feeding about somewhere around 16 to 18 cubes to the Red Sea tank on a daily basis. So very high amount of food. And like I said, I'm all about import and export. I think that when you can feed a lot of food, not only do your fish stay healthy, but your microfauna, you know, your copepods and amphipods and all your other, you know, little creatures that are helping with the biological diversity and helping keep the tank clean and such, you're just going to have a huge population of those. So that's my belief, and it is a little more expensive to feed as much as I do, but I really feel like it's kind of the backbone of really, you know, everything that the tank is getting from a nutritional standpoint from me.
Do you feed aminos or dose other coral foods to help the SPS?
Yeah, so I also put Reefroids in my soup too. I put a couple scoops of that in there. And again, you know, there's no real evidence that SPS actually feed off of it. I don't know whether they do or not, but I do know that the microfauna does for sure. So again, you know, if even if it's not directly feeding, it's feeding that microfauna, which in turn can feed the coral, and so, you know, you got that circle of life going on there. I also dose aminos. I use the Brightwell aminos. And I'm actually working on getting that set up on one of my GHL dosers so that it'll be more steady. But right now I do it on a daily basis, once a day. And then, let's see, I also dose iodine. I've done a lot of ICP tests, and without dosing the iodine, every time it comes back low. So I do dose the Red Sea iodine actually twice a week to try to keep that at proper levels. And I think that's about all that I dose. I try to keep it fairly simple, you know, and I also try to mix a lot of whatever I'm putting into the food so that it gets broadcast whenever I feed. And since I feed so often, you know, it's getting dosed pretty often too. So.
Yeah, I just started making my my own fish food and coral food, and you're right, man. It is a friggin' mess. My wife was like kind of freaking out on me in terms of what the kitchen was looking like, but I tried to do it when she wasn't home, but it didn't work out. That didn't work out that way. All I know is that you know, I basically take all the seafood that I bought in the supermarket, and you know, it was in the freezer, and defrosted it for like an hour or so just to make sure that it was still kind of like held together. And then I started you know, putting it in the food processor. But just like mixing that stuff up by hand, once you get all the different elements in the big bowl, that's freaking cold. But I do mix in Reefroids to that blend as well. So yeah, I think it is important to certainly have some sort of supplementation and something that the like you said, the microfauna or maybe even the corals can get, you know, nutrition from. So we have a question from K-Dub Corals, and this kind of goes back to the early part of our conversation. He says, I'm about to start a new tank with Marco Rock. I do have a good amount of biomedia to add to the sump and some bits of live rock. Do you think that will be enough? I really want to escape with this Marco Rock.
Yeah, absolutely. It really doesn't take much of the biological media, the things like, you know, there's a ton of them out now, but you have Marine Pure, you have Brightwell's products. I personally prefer Matrix, Seachem Matrix is mine of choice, and Ciparex. But with those, they're so porous and they can host so much bacteria. You can run a tank without any live rock in there. And you actually need to be careful not to add too much of those biomedias. When we talked about maintaining phosphate and nitrate, that's another thing that I can do and have done. Is if my nitrates are fine, I'll just reach in and pull out one of the bags. You know, so I don't keep it all in one big bag. It's all, you know, basically it's a bag about this big, and I probably have 15 of them in there. And so I can go ahead and just pull one bag out, and then, you know, I don't have as much bacteria to process waste, so the nutrients will go up that way too. I found early on with the tank, I thought, you know, more is always better, so I had it all loaded up, and my nutrients were zero across the board. Nothing would grow, nothing would color up, and so I learned that lesson the hard way. And it's important to make sure that when you have that biological media in there that you don't overdo it, because you can have too much of a good thing. But yeah, shouldn't be a problem at all with that kind of setup. One thing I would definitely recommend, if you have the opportunity to get even just a small baseball-sized piece of real live rock that's come from the ocean, put it in there. Also, ordering products like the products that I get from Indo-Pacific Sea Farms. That's a great company. They've been around forever. Their website's a little cheesy, but they have what they call, I think, is Wonder Mud, and they have live sand activator. And basically, it's live sand from Hawaii with all the good stuff that comes with it. And you can throw that into your sand bed or into your sump, and you're going to be seeding it with actual bacteria and actual microfauna coming from the South Pacific. So you can't get better than that.
So we have another question, Bill, from Mostly Reefs. What would Bill do if he had vermitid snails?
Bill does have vermitid snails, unfortunately. You know, when I set up my my tank initially, I tried so hard to keep every pest out of there, and those were one of the things I didn't want in there. But you know, it's just so hard. They can hide in so many nooks and crannies, and I dipped everything, and I cut the corals off of plugs before I put them in there. But after time, you know, basically I think one got in there that was in a coral, and they've grown from there. Now I do have a yellow chorus wrasse, and he does eat some of them, so he keeps them in check pretty well in the display tank. And if I see them on the coral or near a coral's base, I will just go in with one of my fragging forceps and squish them. But at this point, it's just not worth my time to try and eliminate them, because I don't think it's really possible once you have them in your tank, unless you're going to get rid of your live rock and start over, as well as you know, cutting the base off of all your corals. It's just not worth it. And over time, I have some small bubble algae in the tank, but my my tangs and my foxface eat that. So the only place it is anywhere where the fish can't reach. So it's very small amounts in there, and it just doesn't bother me anymore. But I haven't found a true solution to vermitid snails. When somebody does, if you want to email me that solution, I'd be certainly happy to give it a try.
Well, you know, it sounds like you're just managing the problem and it's not really harming anything. So, I mean, that's you know, that's the most important thing.
Right. And I do, when I send out frags, of course I don't have live rock in my frag tanks or in my, so I don't really have a problem with the vermitid snails in there, but I do inspect every frag to make sure that there's nothing that's going to be on there that might get transported to somebody else's tank. So I'm very cognizant of that, and I take pride in making sure that everything is clean when it goes out.
So Mostly Reefs is also asking, you know, whether or not a tuxedo urchin might happen to be a solution for those types of snails.
So I've had a couple of different types of urchins in my tank, and I haven't found that they eat them that I know of. I mean, it might make sense that they would, because their shell is a calcareous shell. So you know, but I haven't seen it personally, so I don't know. I try to keep very small urchins when I do have them in my tank, just because, you know, they tend to be bulldozers and plow over things, especially newly mounted frags and such. So I don't have a whole lot of urchins in my tank, but to my knowledge, though, I haven't seen that where anybody said that was a solution. If it was, I would definitely have more urchins.
Yeah, urchins scare me because of the way they could just bowl things over, you know.
Yeah.
I mean, I have enough issues with the giant turbo snails in my frag tank knocking frags off of the racks.
Yep.
Crazy. So we got another question about the size of your aquarium. I guess we're talking about the new aquarium.
Yeah, so it's 7 feet long by 42 inches wide by 30 inches high. It was tank I could fit where it is. Ideally, I really wanted to go 8 feet long by 4 feet wide, but
Yeah.
that would have been a real stretch. But I love having the depth in the tank. That's just you know, when it's always a struggle when you're aquascaping to truly get an aquascape that looks like something you'd see in the ocean. And most of the time, because of most standard tanks, the problem is the depth on it. Getting, you know, you kind of have to, you tend to build up instead of having more of a level structure where you can really get a lot of real estate for frags. So on this tank, I said, okay, I'm going to go double whatever the length is. So, and man, I tell you, I love the look of it. It is absolutely beautiful. It is my dream tank. And, you know, I don't think I'll ever go bigger. You never know, but at this point,
you never do know.
Right, exactly. At this point, this is it. And again, you know, anytime that someone's starting a new tank, I will always recommend look at your width, see what you can do there when you're measuring out where the tank's going to go. And, you know, if you're putting in a 4-foot tank, if you can go bigger than, say, the standard 18 or 24 inches on it and get a 30-inch deep tank, or not deep, but a 30-inch wide tank, you know, go with that. And you're never going to be disappointed having that front to back real estate. It really adds so much to the look of the tank. It's one of the reasons that I went with this as a peninsula tank, is that I'll now have that long view, which I can't wait till I'm able to take pictures of that and such, because it's really going to look like something you'd see in the ocean. I'm an avid scuba diver, and that's always been my dream, is to be able to sit next to the tank and feel almost like I'm on a dive. And that's my hope with how this is going to turn out. We'll see.
I totally agree with you about the width of a tank. You know, my 225 gallon tank that I had back in Connecticut was 30 inches wide. My current 187 gallon tank is 30 inches wide. And before the show, we were talking about, I was thinking about starting another tank, like a peninsula lagoon style type of tank, and for that I was thinking 6 foot long by 36 inches wide by 20 inches tall, and it's so true. I mean, you can really do so many cool things with the aquascape
Right.
on a wide tank, and I do the same thing. I always recommend that people go as wide as you can.
Yep, absolutely.
Bill, somebody is asking whether you have an Instagram page set up or a YouTube channel.
Yeah, I do. I don't have a YouTube channel yet. I do have an Instagram page that I actually just set up. I'm pretty old school, so I'm just learning that. But it is Epic Aquaculture, so you can follow me on there. I also have a website that is going to go live tomorrow, and that's www.epicaquaculture.com. That's where I'll be selling my frags online. Also, I have rainbow bubble tip anemones and Colorado sunburst anemones. And then I also have a presence on Reef to Reef. I go by SaucyJack00 on there. So if you want to check out some of my tank builds, both the current display tank, the Red Sea tank, and the new one, I have build threads on there, so you can kind of follow along with my progress.
All right. Well, K-Dub Coral is started following you on Instagram, so you got another follower there. So I was going to close, Bill, with some rapid fire questions, but I think you've already answered the first one, which is, what is your dream tank? It sounds like you're kind of starting that dream tank right now with this new build.
Well, I do have a swimming pool out back that I might be able to talk the wife into something there.
That would be a big one.
Yeah.
All right, here's the next one, and maybe you've already answered this question as well. What's your favorite fish?
Yeah, so right now it's definitely my blue striped tamarin wrasse that you showed earlier. It's just such a beautiful fish, and you really don't see it in the hobby all that often. But I'm a huge fan of wrasses, so I've got, I think, 7 of them in the display tank right now. I actually just got a flame wrasse yesterday that's just gorgeous. I love it. It's in quarantine right now. Lineatus wrasse is another one of my favorites. But, I love all fish. There's so many unique types, and sometimes, they may not be the most exciting to look at, but their personalities can be just amazing, or their behaviors. So, in the new tank, I'm trying to avoid really large fish, because I want to have a lot of fish numbers-wise, so that it really looks like what a real type of pest. Again, I'm a firm believer in dipping corals when you get them in, and very close inspection. I use a magnifying glass that has a light built into it. And I'll actually hold them up in front of a window where I get plenty of sunlight, because the sunlight really shows things off. And honestly, if I see something on the frag, especially if it's something real alarming, it's going to go into a quarantine tank. I have the ability to set up a quarantine tank very quickly, because like we talked about earlier, I can just pull one of my little 10-gallon tanks and throw some of that Ciparex from my current sump right into a hang-on back filter, and boom, I've got a quarantine tank. So, and I'll dip it, multiple times until I feel like it's possible that it's pest-free, or I shouldn't say possible, that I feel that it is pest-free. or if it just doesn't work out, I may have to dispose of it. So, but yeah, I've been fortunate in terms of pests. Way back in the day, I was one of the first ones to get red bugs. And that was even before anybody, that was back when guys like Ron Shimmick were saying, no, it's just a copepod and there's nothing wrong with it. It's not a bad thing. And I was like, oh, it's a bad thing.
Yeah.
So fortunately, we handle that pretty easily nowadays, which is great, but nobody knew about Interceptor and such back then. So it was a struggle figuring that one out for a while. But yeah, I haven't had too many, again, I've been fortunate, and I think with my, between quarantine and my dipping protocols, I've been able to stay away from those kind of dangerous pests.
So we have another random question. This one from Kenneth Bryant. He says, ask you about the regal angelfish.
Well, that's true. That he brings that up. That's one of my favorite fish too. I have a regal angel in the tank. Been very fortunate with that one. It was the first one I tried, and of course they're reef safe with caution.
Yep.
He does nip on my zoanthids, but he doesn't seem to kill them at all. So, and there are quite a few of the zoanthids on. I have kind of garden, I call it, on a rock that's separate from the other aquascape, so they don't grow onto other things. And he'll get in there and nip on those once in a while, but he leaves my SPS alone, so he's a good resident. But he would be for sure in my top 5 of the fish that I have. He's got a lot of personality and is a very cool fish.
I had one of my 225 gallon SPS dominant tank, and it was my favorite fish. I didn't have anything in there that was tempting, in terms of LPS
Sure.
or Zollers, but I sorely want another one. But I do have a ton of Zoas and some LPS, so probably would be pretty delicious for a regal
Sure.
tank. But if I get that new build going, then there you go.
There you go. There you go. Yeah.
There's always a way to figure it out, right?
I love angelfishes, and I wish more of them were reef safe. I mean, my favorite angel besides the regal is probably a queen angel. They're such beautiful fish, and then the Navarcus angel or blue-girdled angel would be my next one. But again, both of those, definitely no queen angels in my tanks, and even a Navarcus, that's a pretty risky.
Yeah.
Risky there.
Yeah, you're definitely going out on a limb there. So,
Right.
so Bill, I don't want to keep you here too long here. We got a couple of more. One last question from the
right.
folks watching at home. Somebody is asking any tips for Euphyllia not fully opening. Their parameters are DKH of 8, phosphates looks like 0.5. That's pretty low, or I'm sorry, phosphates 0.02 and nitrates. I think it's at 5 is what they're saying. But yeah, they're. Any tips in terms of the Euphyllia?
Well, with LPS and Euphyllia, I don't have as much experience with that. I'm primarily into the SPS corals. I do have a few LPS. For the most part, and I have in the past raised LPS in prior tanks. For the most part, they do like the water a little bit dirtier, so your nitrates and phosphates are kind of in the range of, you might want to look at feeding a little bit or adding some fish if you do have the room for that. If it's something that's come on suddenly, check your equipment. Make sure there's no rusting magnets in your tank. Make sure that there's no stray electricity. I've had an issue about a year and a half ago where a magnetic probe holder rusted, and of course I checked every other magnet in the tank, but I didn't think about that, and I struggled for about a month to figure out what was going wrong with my tank. And finally I said, oh, I never checked this. I looked at it, sure enough, it had cracked and rusted, and once I removed that and did a few water changes, that solved the problem. An ICP test might help. I personally believe that ICP tests they're good for kind of monitoring where things are at, but because they do take, even with the fastest ones, they generally take a couple of days before you get the results back. Things can change in that time period. So I don't think they're great for making changes necessarily, but they can be good for finding things that don't show up on your other test kits, especially things like heavy metals. And when those show up, you definitely want to check for magnets that are rusting and such. So check on some of those things. Otherwise, I've always found that when in doubt, water change. You know, I know a lot of people nowadays try to get by without doing water changes, and more power to you if you have a healthy reef tank that can do that. But man, I'm a firm believer in water changes. On the new system, I'm going to run an auto water change system. I did run one on my current system for a while, but it wasn't real efficient just because of the layout of how I have things. So the new one will work much better. So at this point, I've gone to doing water changes about every 2 weeks. And I've just, you know, whether it needs it or not, everything seems to perk up after water change. And to me, that's just a good indicator that it was a good thing to do.
What percent are you doing on a water change?
So I do at a time, because that's the size of my my current mixing vessel. I'm going to be upgrading that with the new system, and the tank is the display tank is about 250 gallons of total water volume. So you know that comes out to a little bit under 20%, I think, and like I said, I'm doing it about every other week though, so it ends up being somewhere around 40% a month, which is probably higher than most people do, but. Again, for me, you know, I use instant ocean salt because it's the cheapest, and I've used almost every salt out there, and it all seems to work about the same to me. So I believe in that water changes are much more important than spending a bunch of money on a high-end salt, and therefore, you know, I go with the instant ocean that I can get dirt cheap, and then I just do more water changes than I would if I was using a high-end salt.
Yeah, you know, I was using IO, and I ran into a problem. I guess I had a couple of batches where the magnesium and the calcium just really swayed from where they were at. So you got to really be, you know, you got to be diligent, I think, in terms of when you have your, you know, you're mixing up new batches of salt water. You want to make sure that you're testing the parameters, you know, for that new batch before you're putting it in, you know, via water change.
Absolutely, and of course, Instant Ocean runs high on the alkalinity too, so I have kind of a formula for the amount of muriatic acid that I add to it to bring down the DKH to get it down in that 8 range. It generally tests around 10 to 11, and so I don't want to spike my alkalinity when I do a water change. So, you know, a few milliliters of muriatic acid, which I have on hand for my pool anyway, so it gets it into the right range for me.
Well, I want to thank Bill Bramucci. I got it right that time, didn't I?
You did.
I mean, I should be one to hack somebody's name. My name, Berkelhamer, gets hacked all the time. So, you know.
I'm sure.
It's awful. But, Bill, man, I want to thank you so much. This was a great conversation. I appreciate you being on the show. And you know, good luck with the new business, Epic Aquaculture. You know, you've already talked about where folks can find you on the web and on Instagram. So, yeah, let's do this again sometime down the road.
You bet. I also have a Facebook page for Epic Aquaculture, too, if you want to like that. And that's where I'll be announcing things like sales. And also, once coral shows get going again, I'll be doing events like that, bringing my frags on the road to sell. So. But thanks a lot, Keith, for having me. And anytime you want to have an update or anything on the new system, you know, when it's fully up and running and hopefully all grown in, I'd be happy to update you on that too. So
cool, man. Sounds good. All right. Well, listen. Thanks again, Bill. And listen, folks, I'm going to be off next week, but back in 2 weeks. I think that's June 4th, and I'm excited. I'm going to have another old school hobbyist, a fellow by the name of Joe Peck, who I've known for many, many years. He has some kick-ass SPS tanks as well. So that'll be the next episode of Rappin' with ReefBum. Until then.